The U.S.-China trade war has suddenly erupted into a war of words as well, and Huawei, the Chinese telecoms giant, is right in the middle of it. On Thursday, U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo accused the company founder Ren Zhengfei of not telling the truth to the American people or to the world about his company's relationship with the Chinese government. This came just after Ren's impassioned defense of his company, which the U.S. banned last week, went viral across China and even worldwide, earning the 74-year-old man even more respect from Chinese and people around the world. Now, Pompeo's attack on Ren sparked a blistering response from Beijing on Friday as the foreign ministry lambasted U.S. politicians who have, quote, continually fabricated rumors about Huawei and fabricate lies to mislead the American public. Meanwhile, Steve Bannon, widely seen as the grand architect of the economic nationalism and America First ideology that helped elevate Donald Trump to the White House, was widely quoted this week as asserting that driving Huawei from the U.S. market is far more important than any trade deal with China. What's fueling this white-hot rhetoric? And even as more in the U.S. business community expressed concern about the trade war's impact on companies and consumers, where is all this heading? Joining me from Geneva, Switzerland is Dr. Wallace Cheng, a researcher at the German Development Institute. From Washington, D.C., Richard Weitz, a policy expert at Wikistrat Global Consultancy. And in the Beijing studio, Zhao Hai, a research fellow at the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences. Gentlemen, welcome to The Point. In his interview on Thursday, Mike Pompeo said Ren Zhengfei was lying about his company's ties to the Beijing government, and he believed more American companies would cut ties with the tech giant. Let's first hear how the Chinese Ministry of Foreign Affairs responds to Pompeo's remarks.
Recently, certain U.S. politicians are making all kinds of rumors about Huawei, but not giving any of the evidence required by various countries. There have been more and more challenges in the U.S. itself about Washington starting a trade and tech war with China, which has caused market turbulence and hindered cooperation in the related industries. So these politicians continuously made up all kinds of lies of subjective presumption to mislead the public.
So let me go to Wallace in Geneva. What do you think of the fact that U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo came out to accuse the founder of Huawei of lying about his relationship with the Chinese government?
Well, I think the accusation is actually opposite to what President Trump said. He recently said that this is just one of the tactics he used. If there is a trade deal, they want to leverage this into the bilateral negotiations. This is just his tactics to bring a Huawei case. They want to get a deal with China.
Zhao Hai, what's your take on this Pompeo's attacks on Ren Zhengfei?
I think when asked about evidence, Pompeo just directly refused to answer the question and answered that the host asked the wrong question, and then he went on about national security without actually stating what exactly Huawei has done, particularly with the Chinese government, to hurt American national security. And he also pushed not only within the United States, but also outside the United States in European countries, Japan, other countries, trying to establish some kind of alliance against Huawei, global alliance against Huawei, also without convincing the partners outside of the U.S. So fundamentally, I think he's trying to fabricate this wrong notion that Huawei is somehow a branch of Chinese government or working directly with the Chinese government so that they can find an excuse to continue to pressure Huawei and use it.
Exactly. What's the relationship between Huawei and the Chinese government, Zhao Hai, here?
Well, Huawei is a private company, but it's also a very important company that hired 180,000 people around the globe. So I think, on the one hand, Chinese government trying to give an opportunity, making a very good market conditions for the high-tech companies to develop and help China to reach a higher, good quality economic development. On the other hand, I think Huawei and many other companies are competing on a level playing field, particularly outside of China. If you look at in Africa, in other developing countries, and in European markets, I don't think that Huawei is taking any advantage from the Chinese government to help it. And particularly if you also consider Huawei's relationship with the Chinese government, Pompeo particularly attacked Huawei for Chinese law, national security law, because of certain articles that require companies to communicate message with the government. Therefore, preemptively, Pompeo believed that the company must have cooperation with the Chinese government.
Well, if that is the case, we had a discussion about that exact clause in this Chinese intelligence law. If that is the case, then every company would have to, basically the meaning, the premise of that clause is that people have the responsibility to protect a state secret, to protect intelligence, which I think is a normal thing to ask for the citizen of any country. Richard, let me get your perspective here. What do you think of Pompeo's going after the personal credibility of Ren Zhengfei, although he himself is not able to provide any evidence to back up what he describes as the risk posed by Huawei?
Well, I think it builds on your last point, that it's expected that any a company or national would, if their government said it's a matter of national security, we need you to do X, Y, or tell us about Z, most people, including myself, would respond. And I think that's the concern, that if a Chinese company as strong as was mentioned as Huawei, a national champion, seen as leading China's pioneering development in 5G networks, if that is, even without initially having that intention, building up a major base in America, in Europe, and so on, that does give the Chinese government options then later to, in a national security emergency, use that to obtain information that the U.S. and other countries like to keep private. There's also some concern about the founders. He originally served in the Chinese military PLA, and so you would think there might be residual ties. And then lastly, though it's not public, the American officials have stated that they have intelligence information that Huawei still works with the Chinese military and Chinese intelligence services.
But all of this is kind of shaky. I mean, I hate to debate on this again and again, but now that you bring it up, Mr. Weitz, for instance, the fact that Ren Zhengfei was once a soldier, does that mean that he remains a soldier for the rest of his life? This is one thing. And then some of the things that you were talking about, the intelligence that's provided by the U.S. intelligence, even President Trump doesn't trust in the U.S. intelligence service. How can you say, okay, we don't trust there, but we trust here? Richard.
Right. President Trump, as was discussed earlier, he sometimes phrases this more as an economic issue. But for many people, 5G is seen as having strong dual usage issues. So it's designed to support civilian networks, make better phones, allow for great internet applications. But it also has strong military potential and, important for example, for encrypting communication or other means. And therefore, this is really seen as a national security issue, that if there should be a strong 5G network built by countries in, for example, the Five Eyes or NATO.
I see.
Whereas now the 4 or 5 strongest companies are not. And so it's important to have something that you can rely on more.
Well, basically, President Trump has been using the concept of national security so widely. In the end, you don't know what exactly he means by national security. Economic security is also national security. So exactly what is national security? But let's move on a little bit. I wanted to talk about Steve Bannon's remarks. He attacked Huawei on Wednesday in his interview with the South China Morning Post. Bannon said driving Huawei out out of the US and Europe is 10 times more important than a trade deal with China. He said the executive order is 10 times more important than walking away from the trade deal. Huawei is a major national security threat, not just to the US, but to the rest of the world. We are going to shut it down. Wallace, what is your reaction to this kind of rhetoric?
This is kind of classic Bannon's rhetoric, which is totally against the trend of global economy, which is more integrated, and everyone benefit from this more integrated economy with global value chain, that everyone can benefit from that. So that is the baseline, which is Huawei is a Chinese company, but it benefits lots of companies from both upstream and downstream.
Well,
so that is the first point. The second point is that...
Sorry, different from all the points that we have been hearing so far, Bannon seems to take it one step further. He doesn't just want to keep Huawei out of the Western, the Five Eye Alliance, for instance. He wants to shut the company down. Zhao Hai, what could be behind such a strong position on this company that it even can't exist? And compared to the importance of trade deal, which has very strong implications for the economies of the world's two biggest economies.
Well, first let me make this point. I don't think we should even listen to him. He's an ex-White House official. He represents some extreme ideas. He does not represent the majority of American people. Well, now we have this argument. Let's look at it. I think this is very clear, Bannon, that he thought Huawei is a deal breaker, and ultimately he doesn't want U.S. and China has any links. Therefore, he wanted to actually destroy any possibility of reaching a deal between the U.S. and China. Therefore, he threw out the Huawei case and trying to say the U.S. should just kill Huawei. And then he knows very clear, he understands the consequences of U.S. doing that.
Richard, what's your answer to the same question?
Yeah, I mean, Steve Bannon was very close to the president, had a lot of influence in the campaign and the initial policies, but he's since broken strong, but he since no longer has that influence in the White House. He's more influential in some European circles. But the argument again goes to some of the national security issues are very questionable. So when the U.S. says, well, we need to protect steel imports for national security, then there are just a lot of good counter arguments. Well, the U.S. can buy steel from other countries. It doesn't. If one won't sell it, then we can get it from another. Whereas the 5G, as I said, is really seen as having the potential to be the backbone of the future command and control of military and civilian networks.
I want to focus on
really
what Bannon has said about China. For instance, he talked about shutting down this company of Huawei. He talked about dedicating all of his time to shutting Chinese company out of U.S. capital markets. He actually also talked about regime change in China and some kind of fundamental reform that he wants. How extreme, how rational is he, and what kind of danger do you think he's posing if his policy is really carried through by the White House? Richard.
Well, I mean, as was mentioned, he's not representative of the general view in the American public or in Congress. I mean, there are many people concerned about the rise of China and what implications that has for averting a China-U.S. clash along the Thucydides trap argument, which we've discussed before. And then there's the separate economic arguments about China perhaps taking advantage of certain rules given its entry in WTO and so on, that now needs to be rectified given it's no longer a developing economy in our perspective in the U.S. But those kind of views that he was mentioning, regime change and so on, that is not I don't believe that's an actual policy of any U.S. government or most U.S. analysts.
We hope not.